She was just a passenger on Flight 227, hiding her test pilot past. But when the plane started losing control at 36,000 feet, the pilots couldn't save it. Sarah realized with horror she was the only one who understood what was happening. She could save everyone, but only by revealing everything she'd worked to keep secret. Invisible woman or reluctant hero. She had seconds to choose. Either way, her life would never be the same again. Before you watch full story, comment below, from which country are you watching? Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The cabin of Flight 227 cuts through the atmosphere at 36,000 feet, suspended in that peculiar weightlessness where time seems to compress and distance loses meaning. The aircraft, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner carrying 184 passengers and a crew of 10, maintains its steady cruise through the crystalline blue void above the Kansas plains. The morning sun floods through the cabin windows with that particular intensity that only comes at altitude, where the atmosphere has thinned to near vacuum and the earth below becomes a patchwork of geometric precision. Fields and highways rendered abstract by distance. Sarah Chin sits in seat 1 to see her narrow frame nestled against the window, her dark eyes reflecting the landscape passing beneath them. To any of the flight attendants who had served her the coffee and croissant 3 hours earlier at departure, she appeared utterly ordinary. She wore simple dark jeans, a gray travel sweater, and running shoes scuffed from genuine use. Her carry-on bag, tucked beneath the seat before her, contained nothing remarkable. A paperback thriller, a laptop case, a noise-canceling headset she wasn't using. She had exchanged only the most essential pleasantries with her seatmate, a nervous businessman who seemed grateful for her silence rather than offended by it. No one on Flight 227 knew that Sarah Chen had logged over 2,000 hours in experimental aircraft with control systems so fundamentally unstable that conventional recovery procedures were academic fiction. Elegant theories that collapsed against the violent reality of flying machines that wanted to kill you. She had been a test pilot for Lockheed Martin's Advanced Projects division for nearly 8 years before transitioning to aerospace engineering with a specialization in control system failures. Her doctoral research had focused specifically on aircraft, exhibiting unpredictable control behavior during failures of active control systems. The sophisticated computers that kept experimental aircraft stable despite design. Characteristics that would render them uncontrollable through human input alone. She had experienced situations where those computers failed, where the aircraft transformed from a precision instrument into something closer to a living, hostile entity that fought against every control input. She had survived incidents that killed colleagues, had recovered aircraft that other pilots had written off as had pioneered techniques for managing control failure patterns that had no names in commercial aviation, because commercial pilots never expected to encounter them. That was precisely why she had retired from the aerospace industry 5 years ago, and now worked as a freelance technical consultant, a career that allowed her to maintain complete anonymity, to board commercial flights as just another passenger, to sit quietly and coach and observe the world without revelation. The burden of expertise in specialized fields came with a weight that most people never understood. The constant awareness that you knew things others didn't, that you possessed capabilities that existed at the absolute frontier of human knowledge, that you had walked through doors of understanding that closed behind you, separating you from the comfortable ignorance that most people inhabited. Sarah had tired of that separation. She wanted for a few years, at least, to simply exist without the responsibility that came with knowledge. The flight had been entirely smooth thus far. The weather reports had been benign, the winds favorable, the traffic pattern around Denver International clear. Captain James Mitchell, a 19-year veteran with over 13,000 flight hours, had guided Flight 227 into a beautiful cruise attitude, and the autopilot was managing the flight with the mechanical precision that had made modern aviation so systematically safe. The autopilot system coordinated inputs across all 3 control axes simultaneously: pitch, roll, and yaw, adjusting the aircraft's control surfaces with constant micro-corrections that kept the 787 flying with mathematical precision. The flight deck was quiet, professional. The 2 pilots engaged in the comfortable rhythm of experienced aviators managing a perfectly normal flight. Then, at 10:43 in the morning, Captain Mitchell noticed something odd in the subtle vibration feedback he was receiving through the control yoke. It was barely perceptible, the kind of thing that only a pilot with his experience would notice. A frequency in the vibration that didn't match normal aircraft behavior. He glanced at his co-pilot, First Officer Patricia Hoffman, a sharp-eyed woman with 8 years of commercial experience and the kind of methodical attention to detail that made her one of the few people Mitchell truly trusted at altitude. "You feel that?" Mitchell asked, his hand remaining steady on the yoke, despite the growing certainty that something was genuinely wrong. Hoffman was already studying the flight control panel, her eyes moving across the instruments with practiced efficiency. "Feel what?" "The vibration. Something in the feel of the 787 pitched." nose up so violently that Mitchell's words became a grunt of surprise, his body straining against the lap belt as the aircraft's nose rose toward the sky at an angle. That should have triggered immediate autopilot correction, but the autopilot remained engaged, maintaining its programmed altitude, its computers evidently convinced that nothing was wrong. Mitchell's hand moved with instinctive urgency, reaching for the autopilot disconnect. But the aircraft had already begun to recover from its own violent movement, the nose coming back down past the horizon, the pitch stabilizing momentarily before beginning to oscillate again in smaller movements. Autopilot disconnect, Hoffman commanded, her voice carrying the particular clarity of someone whose adrenaline had suddenly spiked into high alert. Mitchell killed the autopilot. The autopilot disconnect was always the first move in any scenario where the aircraft began behaving erratically, a fundamental principle drilled into every commercial pilot. If the automation isn't working, take manual control. But as Mitchell took the yoke, he felt something profoundly wrong in the feedback. The aircraft felt sluggish in pitch, the normal responsive behavior absent, replaced by something closer to a delay. He would input a control command, and the aircraft would respond. But the response felt disconnected from his input, lagged, as if his hands weren't really connected to the control surfaces at all. It was the sensation of flying an aircraft through an invisible medium of resistance and inertia that shouldn't exist. "We've got something," Mitchell said quietly, his voice steady despite the cold recognition crystallizing in his mind. "Flight 227, we're experiencing control anomalies. Climbing to flight level 380 requesting vectors for return to Denver." The controller's voice came back confused, asking for clarification on the nature of the problem. But Mitchell couldn't clarify what he didn't understand. The aircraft had settled into straight and level flight momentarily, but the feel remained wrong. The control feedback suggesting something fundamentally broken in the system, connecting his inputs to the aircraft's control surfaces. The instruments showed everything normal, airspeed stable, altitude holding, heading constant. But the feel in his hands told him a completely different story. A narrative written in vibration and resistance that his instruments weren't capturing. In the cabin, the passengers had felt the sudden pitch up, a moment of weightlessness followed by the aircraft's violent descent back to level flight. Most of them had rationalized it as turbulence, some kind of unexpected weather phenomenon. Commercial aviation was safe, accidents were extraordinarily rare, and people had remarkable capacity to minimize fear by assuming that what had just happened was normal, was expected, was nothing to worry about. A businessman reading the Wall Street Journal barely glanced up. A woman in the back returned to her movie. The aeronautical reality was that thousands of commercial flights encountered unexpected movements, and virtually all of them resolved into nothing serious. Sarah, however, had felt something else entirely. She had felt the pattern in the movement, the pitch-up that seemed to come from nowhere, the recovery that didn't feel like normal automatic pilot correction, the underlying oscillatory tendency in the aircraft's behavior. She had felt the thing that only someone with her experience would recognize. The signature movement of a control system fighting itself, the harmonic resonance of active control systems, interacting with aerodynamic forces in ways that created amplifying rather than dampening feedback. Her eyes opened, and she sat down her paperback novel with deliberate care. She closed her eyes and extended her senses, feeling the aircraft's movement through her body, through the seat, through the subtle vibrations transmitted through the fuselage like a pulse. The aircraft remained steady for several seconds, long enough for Sarah to believe she might have imagined the problem, that perhaps nothing was truly wrong, that perhaps her mind was generating patterns that didn't exist. Then it happened again. The 787 banked abruptly to the left, a rolling motion. Failures. The 787 was descending through 24,000 feet when Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, attempting to project calm that was barely comprehensible beneath the strain that every passenger could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our flight control system. We're working on this with our flight crew, and we're diverting to Denver International for an emergency landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will get this situation under control." The announcement triggered something primal in the passenger cabin. This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't weather. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. This was a captain telling them that the aircraft's control system wasn't working properly, that they were experiencing something so serious that an emergency landing was being declared, that their survival was no longer guaranteed by the routine miracle of modern aviation. A man in the back was crying, his shoulders shaking with the release of fear that he could no longer contain. A woman across the aisle had her eyes closed, her lips moving, possibly praying, possibly reciting mantras, possibly just trying to maintain her sanity. The businessman who had been sitting next to Sarah was gripping the armrest so hard his fingers were white, the tendons standing out like rope beneath his skin. Sarah moved. She moved with the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty, from knowing that hesitation meant death for everyone aboard. from understanding that the window of opportunity was closing with every passing second. She moved toward the forward galley, toward the cockpit door, aware that she had only seconds to make a decision that would expose her, that would end her anonymity forever, that would reveal everything about her that she had carefully kept hidden from the world. She was trading her invisibility for the possibility of survival for everyone aboard. And she made that trade without hesitation. The cockpit door was locked. It had to be locked. Every commercial aircraft required it since the security changes implemented years earlier. Since the terrible morning when aviation safety had been fundamentally redefined by the actions of men with murderous intent. Sarah pressed the call button, her hands steady despite the aircraft pitching wildly around her, despite another roll excursion that would have sent her crashing into the seats if she hadn't been gripping the armrest with desperate strength. The cockpit door opened because the flight deck crew was desperately hoping for some communication, some additional information, some indication that something external could explain what was happening to their aircraft. Some way that someone from outside the isolated world of the flight deck could help them understand the failure they were experiencing. A flight attendant's face appeared, eyes wide with fear and confusion, and behind her, Sarah could see Captain Mitchell's focused expression. First Officer Hoffman's concentration. The indicators on the flight control panel dancing with erratic information. "I need to speak to the captain immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that made the flight attendant step back. That made the cabin crew member recognize that this was not a passenger request or a passenger demand, but rather an assertion of knowledge and understanding. "I'm a test pilot and aerospace engineer. Your control system is oscillating due to phase lag between the input command and control surface position. You need to manually command the elevator and ailerons asymmetrically to dampen the oscillation rather than fighting it. Use asymmetric engine thrust to create a yaw moment that will interact with the pitch oscillation in a way that damps the roll component. That's your only option before the aircraft departs controlled flight." The flight attendant stared at her with confusion and disbelief. But something in Sarah's voice, something in her absolute conviction and precise technical knowledge, something in the particular way she was describing system interactions that existed nowhere in standard commercial training, overcame the normal security protocols and the reasonable skepticism that should have met such an extraordinary claim. She turned and disappeared into the cockpit, leaving the door open just far enough that Sarah could see Captain Mitchell's face as he processed information that his brain was having difficulty accepting, that someone, a passenger with zero credentials, was claiming to have the answer to a technical problem that was beyond his immediate understanding, that existed at the frontier of his knowledge. Mitchell looked at her, really looked at her, seeing a woman with calm in her eyes that matched the chaos surrounding them. A woman with the particular stillness that came from having faced death before and having survived through knowledge and skill rather than luck. A woman whose very presence suggested that she understood something fundamental about what was happening to his aircraft. "Come," he said simply, and those two words contained the absolute trust of a professional pilot, recognizing expertise in a domain where his own knowledge was failing. Sarah entered the cockpit, moving with careful precision despite the aircraft's continued violent movements, the envelope of controlled flight becoming increasingly narrow with each oscillation cycle. The 787 was descending through 19,000 feet now, and Denver International's runway was still nearly 200 meters away. They were running out of time with the physical certainty of mathematics, with the inevitability of physics. "The oscillation is creating a feedback loop," Sarah said, her voice steady and clinical, despite her heart hammering against her ribs, despite the adrenaline flooding her system, despite her conscious awareness that she was about to stake her knowledge against the laws of physics. "Your pitch and roll inputs are coordinated by the flight control computer through the autopilot. But with the autopilot off, you're commanding manual inputs that don't have built-in damping. Each input creates an overshoot, which creates a correction, which creates another overshoot. It's getting worse, because you're responding to the symptom rather than to the root cause. You have to dampen the oscillation, not fight it." Hoffman stared at her. Mitchell stared at her. The aircraft pitched down violently, and Mitchell had to grip the yoke with both hands to prevent the dive from steepening into an uncontrollable descent, to prevent the aircraft from transforming from a recoverable emergency into a fatal impact situation. "What do you need us to do?" Mitchell asked. The fact that he asked the absolute absence of ego or skepticism in his question told Sarah everything she needed to know about him. He was a good pilot, a professional who understood that, in desperate emergencies, conventional wisdom sometimes failed, that unconventional solutions sometimes worked, that the difference between survival and catastrophe was often the willingness to trust expertise when that expertise came from unexpected sources. He was a pilot who understood that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Asymmetric thrust," Sarah said, speaking with rapid precision. "Use the engines to dampen the roll oscillation instead of trying to fight it with the aileron. Command one engine to higher thrust while reducing the other. That creates a yaw moment that will interact with the pitch oscillation in a way that should dampen the roll." Simultaneously reduce your elevator inputs to minimum necessary to maintain altitude. Let the aircraft settle into a smaller oscillation pattern, then work to damp it out rather than trying to arrest it all at once. That's going to drag us off heading, Hoffman said, her voice carrying professional concern about departing from the direct route. Yes, Sarah confirmed, her eyes meeting Hoffman's with unflinching directness. But you're going to have a heading. You won't have a heading if the aircraft departs controlled flight. You'll have impact with the Earth at high velocity and a crater instead of a heading. Mitchell's hands moved with trained precision, engaging the manual thrust control for the right engine, reducing the throttle with smooth, deliberate movement, commanding the left engine to full power with practiced authority. The effect was immediate. The aircraft's roll motion, instead of continuing to oscillate wildly and increasing amplitude, began to couple with the yaw axis, the nose yawing away from the intended heading, the fuselage rotating around the vertical axis, but the roll motion diminishing, the violent wing rock becoming less pronounced, the oscillation frequency beginning to decrease. Sarah felt the change in the oscillation frequency, felt the way the aircraft's motion was transitioning from a dangerous departure toward something more manageable, felt the physics beginning to work in their favor rather than against them. Elevator input, Sarah said. Reduce it to near neutral. Let the pitch find a natural equilibrium rather than driving it. Mitchell eased back on the control yoke with careful restraint, reducing the back pressure he had been maintaining with white-knuckle intensity. The result was counterintuitive. The aircraft's pitch rate should have increased. The nose should have dropped into an accelerating dive. But instead, the pitch oscillation began to dampen. The amplitude of the oscillations was decreasing, the violent movements becoming less extreme, the feedback in the yoke beginning to stabilize into something that resembled normal aircraft behavior. We're at 15,000 feet, Hoffman reported, her voice carrying less panic now, the data flowing, the problem becoming less abstract, and more like an actual technical situation, with dimensions and parameters that they could measure and understand. Heading is